This lecture will cover Chapter 3 from the textbook, Skills for Not Knowing and Leading from One Step Behind. These skills that are covered in this chapter, there are quite a few, and they are the foundational skills that you will need regardless of where you find yourself working in the field of social work, because these skills are foundational for communicating effectively with individuals. And so we will be covering quite a bit of material. I will highlight the items that this course will specifically focus on, so you can make sure to hone in especially on those skills. But I do want to make sure you're aware of all of the skills mentioned in this chapter, since they are helpful in your work with individuals and clients. Let's get started. So the posture of not knowing is based from solution-focused therapy, and what it basically espouses is that we are not the experts. While we may have skills to effectively and professionally help others, that's why you go to school, that's why you learn the skills, that's why you're in this course, but we are not the experts of all of the clients that we work with, because we will never know exactly what it is like to be in their situation and to experience their experiences, as well as to have survived the elements and the circumstances that they've come through. We may have come through something similar, but it's never identical, and therefore we are never the expert of their circumstance, but instead the client is the expert of their circumstance. So this posture of not knowing is that stance that because I'm not the expert of your situation, that means that I need to learn more about your situation so that I can have an accurate view of it. The client is the expert. They have the right perceptions. They have the right view for their circumstance. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they may be doing all the right things that work for their circumstance, but that's where you come into play, where you can work with them and collaborate to figure out positive solutions. What this means for you as a practitioner, though, is that we need to set aside those frame of reference, those belief systems, the cultural views, all of those elements that make us who we are. We need to set that aside, because we run into problems when we bring in those perspectives and assumptions into our work with our clients, and we assume and presume a lot of our own feelings and our own stuff instead of trying to explore and understand the client's perspective. So your role as a practitioner and as you learn these skills is to set aside those frame of reference as much as possible. That non-judgmental stance that is so critical in social work is something that comes from the view of setting aside your own frame of reference and trying to understand your client. So this means that you have to rely on your client's perceptions, which means that you have to ask the right questions and engage in the right dialogue to help fill in the blanks. Because you see, when we set aside our own frame of reference and it's no longer on the table, now you have this nice blank page. And you have your client, and it's up to you and that client to dialogue and discuss and ask and explore to fill in the blanks on that page so that you can have the accurate picture of what's going on for your client and what they're hoping to gain. And so that's the role that then you fill from the posture of not knowing, is trying to understand the perceptions and explanations that your client is experiencing. I want to read together this great quote from your text from Anderson and Gulishian, not knowing position. The not knowing position entails a general attitude or stance in which the therapist's actions communicate an abundant, genuine curiosity. Notice it's a curiosity because we don't know what those blanks are until we ask, and so we're curious about finding out more from that client's perspective. That is, the therapist's actions and attitudes express a need to know more about what has been said rather than convey preconceived opinions and expectations about the client, the problem, or what must be changed. The therapist therefore positions himself or herself in such a way as always to be in a state of being informed by the client. And so this is the foundational perspective that we're going to look through this lens as we go through the skills in the rest of this chapter. So some of the basic interviewing skills that we will discuss. As you first start working with your client, you want to make sure that you're keeping in perspective who and what is important to the client. Each person has someone, whoever those individuals may be, that are important, and you will need to know and figure that out earlier on in your relationship with the client, because those key facts are going to help you as you continue exploring solutions with your client. So figure out who and what are important to your client. Notice hints of possibility. We come from a strengths perspective where we know that no matter what the situation is, every single person, every single client that we work with has strength. They have an ability to succeed and to overcome circumstances that we may not fully understand. And so, as you're hearing your clients share their story, as they're relating their experience, notice and key into those hints of possibility. When they mention that something went well, or they had this past success, or you can notice that they have all of these awful things happening, and yet these strengths emerge where they're seeking help and they're trying to improve their circumstance. So key in on those hints of possibility. And make sure to echo and incorporate clients' keywords. Sometimes we will frequently use words that are not keywords. The word the, and, those are not keywords. We are frequently using them in day-to-day conversation. However, you will notice those keywords that your client will say, those things that they use to describe their circumstance, and it's important that you tune into those words and then you also use them. And it's a good way of being able to use those words later with some of the skills that we're going to learn, so that way the client can know that you're really tracking with them. If your client is saying, and they keep describing their life as a wreck, when you reflect and you paraphrase back to your client, being able to use that term, wreck, as they did, is going to help align your view with what the client has been sharing with you. So make sure to key into keywords that your client shares, and this is one of this skill is a noted skill in this course because it's important for you to be able to put up that antenna and start sensing what are those key words, those key phrases, those key themes that your client is sharing. So when it comes to questions, we all can ask questions. We can ask a myriad of questions. We can ask a lot of questions that really don't help at all. And so the key is to ask the right questions for the right purpose. You are not just barraging your client with a bunch of questions that they need to answer with data or facts or with feelings. That send you into a spiral, and you will know. And earlier on, practitioners will get this sense where they're just kind of spiraling and running around in circles, asking all these questions, and the client's answering, and they're getting information, but nothing's going anywhere. And it's just becoming confusing, and the client might start feeling a bit attacked. They might feel more defensive because they're being asked so much, and they're not feeling validated. So that's why it's so important that you learn early on what kind of questions are needed. And when you're coming from the perspective of not knowing, right from the beginning, you want to figure out who's important to this client, what's important to this client, what are they hoping to gain in their time with you, what are their goals, what is the current issue at hand, and what do they want instead. All of these perspectives will help you in crafting the right questions for the right purpose, so that you're not just asking questions for the sake of asking. Some of the most damaging things that can happen is when we just ask for the sake of asking, and then our client leaves and feels like they just asked a bunch of things that didn't even relate to what was going on. I'm never going back there again. So make sure that you're being intentional with the kind of questions that you're asking, and practice this in your day-to-day. When you're speaking with your friends, your family, your loved ones, and they're telling you about their problems, try to think about what is important here. What are they wanting instead? Let me understand the circumstance, and be intentional with what you ask. Open-ended versus closed-ended questions. Both are helpful in working with clients. You will need to use both. And so make sure that you know how to use them appropriately. Early on, individuals will use a lot of closed questions. Closed questions are questions that really result in a one-word response. Maybe it's yes or no, or it's just a one-word or maybe two-word type of response. Do you like talking to a counselor? That response is either a yes or a no or a maybe. But being able to ask open-ended questions invites more dialogue to occur. So instead of me asking, did you have a good day, which means that you could have said no or yes, I can instead ask, how was your day? Or can you tell me about your day? And that leaves it open for me to elaborate, however it would be helpful to then engage further and get more detail. You will use closed-ended questions here and there in your interview, but I want you to focus truly asking more open-ended questions. And you will sense if you ask questions and you just get a one-word response, and then you have to ask another question and you get another one-word response, you're probably using too many closed-ended questions and you're not elaborating enough in your interviews. So practice open-ended questions, rephrasing questions in a way so that the person and your client has to answer in a little bit more than just a one-word yes-no type response. When your client gives you information, maybe they tell you their life is a wreck and they're so stressed out, use that information and ask for more details. So you say your life is a wreck. Can you explain to me more about what that looks like for you? This is my way of asking a question so that I can fill in the blanks. And so use follow-up questions for the information that you're gathering from your client so that way you can understand the situation more clearly. That page is blank as can be until you fill in the gaps. And when your client gives you lead questions, when they start telling you things like things are just so overwhelming, I don't know what to do next, instead of asking a random tangential question about what they eat for dinner, expand further on what are some things that they feel are the most overwhelming in their circumstance. So that way you can understand the situation better. So learn how to ask the right questions for the right purpose. Avoiding why questions. We're about to elaborate that. This is something that I want to encourage that you avoid, and we're going to get into it in just a minute, so hang tight. So why not why? The famous question. Why is a great question to ask in our minds. Why is this happening? What do I need to do differently? That's not a why question, but it's a great question for critical thinking when we're trying to find answers. And so it's a great skill. But when you're interviewing someone, when you're working with a client, and all you're asking are why questions, it can sometimes come off as you just digging deeper into the problem. Why did this happen? Why do you think he did this? Why do you think you reacted that way? Why? And if you think of times when someone has asked you why, and maybe asked a lot of why questions of you, oftentimes humans may become a little bit more defensive, whether it's an aggressive defense or maybe they just feel like they have to explain their reasons. If I ask you, well, why did you do that? You might have the sense that you need to explain what your reasons were and defend your actions. We don't want our clients to feel like they're being judged and that they're having to defend their actions. And so that's why instead of asking why, which is the easy way of asking a question, right? I want you to use other forms. Use the whats, the hows, the whos, the where, the exploring questions that reframe those same type of questions that you might ask in a why format, reframe it and take out the why. It's a nice challenge, but I guarantee you that when you can really focus on not using why and being creative and using other ways of finding information, you will be a more productive and a more effective interviewer because you're not falling back on just the easy way out, which is to say, well, why do you think that is? Why did you do that? Why didn't you do that? We want our clients to feel empowered, and I find that why often does the opposite. So I want you to try other ways to see how that works for you. Summarizing, paraphrasing. This is a key skill in this course, so tune in. This is something you will need to know. Summarizing is you're restating the client's thoughts, their actions, their feelings. Whatever content they've told you, whatever feelings they've shared with you, it's a summary. It literally is how you summarize a statement when you go back to English Comp 101 and you have to write a summary statement and you recap all of the highlights. That's literally what you're doing in a verbal format. You might use it after a detailed description. Let's say the client shares a very long story with a lot of detail and they've used keywords. You want to make sure to give a summary so that you can make sure that you've really understood exactly what's gone on and that you're using their keywords. Note that summarizing as well as paraphrasing is not parroting. Parroting would be you tell me, I'm feeling really stressed out. And then I say, you're feeling really stressed out. And then you say, yes, I've got a lot of work to do. And then I respond back to you and I say, you've got a lot of work to do. You can see how a few exchanges like this, and that client probably would not come back to me if that's the therapist that I am to them. You're not just regurgitating words back. You're summarizing in brief, using those keywords, and then putting the rest in your words so that way then you can make sure that your understanding is what the client has tried to portray to you. I suggest using summarization at the end of session. It's a really nice segue to end your session. So as you're wrapping up, you can say, all right, Mr. Thomas, we've talked a lot today about some of the different things that you've overcome and some of the different goals that you have and you're trying to attain here. And so what we've discussed is blah, 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 blah. You can recap what was discussed, and then it's a very natural segue to say, is there anything I've missed, or is there anything more that you wanted to add as we wrap up the session? Mr. Thomas could add anything more he wanted to add, and if he didn't have anything more, then you can segue into closing off your session with saying something like, okay, great. Well, I'd like to be able to talk with you more, and I didn't know if you'd want to meet again next week or what would be the most convenient thing for you. So summarizing is a really nice tool that you can use at the end of your session to recap what's going on and then to set a plan for the future. You can also use it during session, but I want to make sure that you are careful not to just summarize a lot in your session, because it does lose its efficacy if you're just parroting again. And so use it as it's relevant and as it's helpful, when your client does give you a lot of information and you want to make sure you're on track. Paraphrasing is just like summary, except it's the shortened version. It's the little sister of summarization. And so instead of summarizing everything in context, paraphrasing are little snippets of recaps throughout the session. And this is something I want to see you practice and demonstrate throughout your interviews. When a client gives you information, sometimes just a one-word paraphrase is all you need to do to make sure that they know that you're listening and that you're tracking with them. So you can use paraphrasing to encourage their discussion, to clarify information that you're receiving, as well as letting them know that you're listening. Paraphrasing is nice because it's not as long as summarization, so it doesn't break up the conversation as much. Summarizing could be a longer chunk of material, and so it might take more time for you to summarize, and paraphrasing is just a briefer way of being able to give back that information to your client. I suggest that you use paraphrasing throughout the session, either alone or as a nice link to a question or to an empathic remark or a statement. So for example, if your client's saying, I'm so stressed out, I've got so much on my plate, I'm a single mom, I have children at home, and I'm trying to work and I'm going back full time. That's a lot of information. Saying something like, so things are really stressful for you, is just a brief way of me recapping what was just said to me. And then it would be a nice segue for me to say, can you tell me how you've been handling this stress so far? And so it's a nice link from summarizing or paraphrasing what the client just told me, and then moving into either another statement or question. This is a skill that takes practice, so don't be discouraged if it's not coming naturally, but start thinking in ways of when a client gives you information, think, how can I briefly paraphrase this, and then I'll move into a question or to whatever response I'm going to give. So use this and practice this readily, because it really will help your clients to feel heard, guaranteed. Silence. This is a fun one because in spite of what you may think, it is your friend. So often in an interview, when it gets quiet, early practitioners might think, oh no, I've got to fill in the silence. Let me just ask a question, any question. It doesn't matter what it is. Let me just fill in this awkward silence. When in reality, silence is such a powerful tool when you have come to grips with how to use it. And notice it's really about you coming to grips with whatever that feels like. So using silence for your benefit. So often we try to rush and fill in the gaps when that interrupts our client's thinking. And oftentimes when we allow silence to be in the session, where maybe you've asked a question or maybe the client just finished saying something and it was such a powerful statement that you both wanted to just marinate a little bit on what was just said, and maybe a few seconds pass by. And sometimes that time allows the client to sort through their thoughts so they can consider their feelings, their circumstance, or sometimes it just gives them a break. Sometimes they have so much that they have to share, and it's exhausting. And so silence is a nice break for both the client and for you to maybe regroup what's going on. So respect and use silence. There can be times where silence can be very awkward, but I want you to start practicing now. I find more often than not, individuals are more likely to rush and avoid silence than to overuse silence. And so if you find yourself on that spectrum where you're trying to avoid having any silence in your session, I challenge you to start practicing relaxing enough in the moment and allowing the time and the space to fill in a way that you can use the silence for the benefit of the session. And so embrace silence. It is not your enemy. It actually is very helpful. And when you ask a question to your client, sometimes they need that time to respond. When we're nervous, time flies by. And so we can ask a question and think, my goodness, maybe they didn't understand. Or my goodness, I need to rephrase it, or I need to ask it again because maybe they missed it. And that's where then we fill in the silence with a bunch of jargon, and really it's garbage because the question itself was okay as it was. So give yourself this thought. When I ask a question, if the client doesn't answer right away, in your mind, as you start off, maybe just count to 5 or count to 7 seconds and allow that time to encourage your client maybe to respond or to give them enough time to think of their response so that they can answer your question. Oftentimes, as a teacher, I will ask a question of my class, and I will ask the question and I will wait. And it may be awkward, but more times than not, when I give that time and the silence, somebody will put their hand up or somebody will respond and answer and contribute positively to the class environment. And the same holds true with clients. When working with clients, being quiet, allowing them to have that time and space is really a helpful tool. So don't be scared of it. It is your friend. Keeping in mind your nonverbal behavior is such a key component to establishing that rapport with your client. So often, communication can entail what we say, but it's also how we say it. And so making sure that our nonverbal signals and cues are matching the messages that we're sending through our words, and that our voice tone is also supporting that type of message that we're giving to our clients. What you say is important. It's not so much, I know there's sayings out there that say it's not what you say, it's how you say it. But what you say still is important, so don't negate that. But so is how you say it, because that can either throw doubt into your message, or it can negate your message if your body language or your nonverbal behavior is supporting something different from what your mouth may be saying. So some of your nonverbal behavior that I want you to keep in mind, and this is a nice little acronym to keep in mind, is SOLAR. S stands for sit upright, so watching slouched posture, making sure that you're sitting comfortably but that you're not slouching over forward or even slouching back. This isn't just you chatting with a friend so that you're lounging on your chair and just seeing what's going on. This is a professional environment where you're communicating with an individual, so make sure your posture shows that. Where you're sitting upright, you have open posture, careful with crossed arms or crossed legs, since oftentimes when we cross our arms and legs, it can send an inadvertent message to our client that we are very happy to be there, or we're would rather be somewhere else, and we're just a bit more resistant to connecting with them. So keep an open posture. Lean forwards just slightly, just to show your interest. And this is something that's a natural lean, so make sure that you're not trying to over-exaggerate that where it might make the client uncomfortable, but just a natural lean where you're moving into the situation and letting your body language show that I am interested and I'm here and I want to know all about what's going on for you. Keeping positive eye contact, so you're making sure that you're keeping that eye contact with your client. You're not just staring at them, which would be spooky and would probably be disarming for them, but you're keeping a natural level of eye contact so that they know that you're tracking with them and you're not just watching everything that's happening in the room, or you're looking down at your notes, or you're looking at your watch and you're checking your pants and you're checking your the hair in the mirror. You get the point. The bottom line is make sure that your eye contact is showing that they are your sole focus in that interviewing session. And last but not least, R stands for relax. You can have all these pieces, but if you're really tightened and you're very stressed out in your posture, that's going to display to your client as well. And they're going to sense that you are tight and you're nervous and you're stressed out, and your posture is going to show that to them. So make sure you're relaxed as well. The more you practice, the more these things will come naturally, so you can relax more. I know in the beginning, as you're learning these skills, it can be harder to relax because you're so worried about all of those other pieces that you're trying to accomplish at the same time. But keep practicing, and it will help the relaxation piece to come into play so that you can be more natural in your presentation with your nonverbal behavior. And I like this cartoon as we start talking about the client's nonverbal behavior, because looking at this cartoon, we've got the speaker that's saying, "This concludes my lecture on nonverbal communication. Any comments or questions?" And we have his audience, where one's sleeping, one's sticking out her tongue, one's making a gesture at his with his face and his hands. And so we want to make sure that we are not that kind of therapist that is completely oblivious to what verbal language and nonverbal language our client is giving to us. So key in, really tune into what nonverbal language your client is showing you. So figure out and know that you're looking at the nonverbal language not as an isolated thing where you're dissecting it, because we also can run into problems when we start assuming what the nonverbal language may mean. If your client has their eyes down and is looking at the floor, well, you can assume that maybe they're upset, maybe they're embarrassed, maybe they're ashamed, maybe they're depressed. I mean, there's so many meanings that you can attribute to that one nonverbal piece. So take the nonverbal and put it in context with the verbal and the nonverbal so that it helps give you a more accurate picture, and never assume what it means, but instead try to allow your understanding as well as the client's information that they're giving you to help give you the clearest view. Remember that culture also impacts nonverbal behaviors. For certain culture, it's very disrespectful to maintain direct eye contact, and so they may never look at you in the eye. And if you're not keeping those things in mind, you may assume that maybe they are uncomfortable or they don't respect you, when it's completely the opposite. So keep culture in mind, as that may play into nonverbal language. And then tune into those signals that your client is offering you, making sure that you're still staying in the posture of not knowing. So you're not assuming what that means, but you're taking that information in along with what they're telling you, and you're trying to understand. Do they seem engaged in the process? Does your client seem completely resistant? Do they seem removed? Are they deep in thought or upset or confused or defensive? All those things, take in their language that they're offering you, both verbal and nonverbal, and allow it to help enhance your understanding for your client. So the great question, to disclose or not to disclose? That is the question. There are two types of self-disclosing. The first is when you were referring to you as a practitioner sharing your own past experience and your beliefs or your thoughts with the client. For example, your client says, well, my parents are going through a divorce and I'm having a hard time dealing with that. This type of self-disclosure with this meaning here would be you saying, you know what, my parents also went through a divorce and I remember it was a really hard time for me too. What's the problem with that? The problem with that kind of self-disclosure is that now the focus is no longer on the client, but it's been shifted to you and to your circumstance and to your past issues and challenges with your parents' divorce. And the client must stay central to the focus of the session. Now, some practitioners may feel like there are certain times where some self-disclosure is helpful. That might be a more personal view, but in general, in this course, I want you to focus on keeping yourself out of the equation. It's not about you. It's not about your past experience, because the reality is maybe your parents did divorce, but your situation might be completely different. Maybe in your circumstance, it was actually the most positive divorce that could be, whereas your client is coming from an awful situation. And how will your client feel when they ask you, how did that turn out? And you tell them, oh, actually, it's great. I keep in contact with both parents, and I'm able to go to both families for the holiday, and everything's just in a peaceable way, and we've really adjusted nicely. Well, if the client situation isn't so nice, that can actually be discouraging. Or the opposite. Maybe your circumstance is worse than the client, and now the client feels pity or feels empathy towards your circumstance, and now you are the central part of the session versus it being the client. So this is one type of self-disclosure, and as you see at the statement here, it equals not being helpful because it detracts from the helping environment. The other type of self-disclosure that is helpful, and I want to explain it because in definitions it looks similar, but it is very different. This type of self-disclosure refers to when you share your thoughts and observations that relate to the client session. So it's not you sharing your thoughts about how you believe that, there's never an excuse for divorce, for example, and the client's telling you about their parents' divorce. Not that kind of sharing of your thoughts, but more of, you mentioned that you were really happy about your parents' divorce and that you think it's the best thing that could have happened, but yet I'm just noticing that when we talk about this topic, it seems like there's just your verbal language, your eyes kind of go downcast, and you seem just a bit more upset. And I'm curious to know if you could help me understand what's going on and what are you thinking there so I can have a better understanding. That's the kind of sharing of your thoughts and observations that helps enhance the session because the focus is still on the client, and it can actually enhance your understanding when you put those pieces together and then share when there are things that aren't synonymous and when there are discrepancies in what your client's saying and what they're showing you. So use your senses, use your critical thinking abilities to analytically assess the situation, and then make sure that you're using that to help the solution building process. So as I mentioned earlier, the word of caution is keep the focus of the session on the client, not you. Remember, it's not about you, it's about them. Your role is to help guide them to find solutions within their frame of reference and past experiences and not yours. So I encourage you keep your self-disclosure when it comes to your past experiences and what you've lived through out of it. It really doesn't matter because you have the skills to help facilitate the process whether or not you have an experience to match. Complimenting is another skill that we use for the process of collaborating with our clients and to building rapport. And I like this clip art here of the little kitty cat that's looking in the mirror and sees the reflection as a lion. And oftentimes our clients look in a mirror, so to speak, and they don't see a lion. They don't see something greater than what is at face value. And oftentimes they might see something that's worse. And so I like to think of our role as a practitioner where we sometimes are that mirror that we hold up and we allow them to see the strengths and the true successes that they really are, that maybe just along the way they've forgotten, along the way they've missed being able to take note of these valuable pieces and these inner strengths and successes that they have achieved. And so I like using this clip art as just an analogy and a visual analogy of how we can be that mirror that reflects those strengths and successes. So complimenting is one way that we bring about and magnify those strengths that we see in our clients. We are drawing on those strengths of their current situation as well as in the past and how they've succeeded. It's reality-based. We're not just complimenting based on something nebulous or vague, or we're not just giving them a cookie-cutter compliment that we give all of our clients, because the reality is there are no two individuals alike and no two situations that are alike, and so therefore make it something that's reality-based, that's current and relevant to your clients, so that it truly is a genuine compliment and it isn't just something that you're saying for the sake of saying it. There are two types of compliment. The direct compliment has to deal with a positive evaluation or reaction by you in response to the client. So an example would be, you seem to be a student that's committed to excellence. And if I say that to my client, it is a direct compliment because I'm noticing something that they've shared with me. It's not just coming out of thin air, but they've given me reasons why this would be a relevant, genuine compliment that is based in reality. Indirect compliment is the other type of compliment, and this is more, it stems from a question that implies that something is happening that's positive about your client. So in spite of all of your stress, how have you managed to still earn good grades in school? And so notice that I'm not flat out just saying you seem to be a student committed to excellence, which is more of the direct compliment way, but instead I'm asking a question that implies that you've done something really good here. This is impressive that you have still managed all of this stress you've managed the stress and you've managed good grades in spite of everything that's going on. And so know the difference between a direct compliment, which is at face value, you give the reality-based compliment, and an indirect, which really is more of a indirect way of questioning and allowing the client to then share their successes. And so it still brings that compliment and strengths to light and magnifies it, but it does it in an indirect way. You want to also affirm clients' perspectives. Our clients come from all walks of life, and some of them are very different from our own. And some of their thoughts, some of their actions, their beliefs are completely opposite to what you may have. But remember, because we come from the posture of not knowing, where we can set those feelings aside and those differences aside, we want to make sure that we affirm our clients' perceptions. In the corner of this PowerPoint slide, there is a photo in black. Now, either some of you may see that as a vase, where the vase is the white, or for some of you, if you look at the black part of the photo, you may say two faces that are facing each other. Which do you see, the vase or the two faces? Our clients are the same way. Neither one is wrong. They are both correct perceptions, and they're both there. Sometimes we have our own perception, sometimes our clients have a completely different perception, but it's important for us to affirm what they see, because that is their reality, and that's what they live with, and that's what they must survive through. And so we affirm those short statements when our clients are expressing how overwhelmed they feel, how unsure they are about their decisions. Those short statements that we make, whether it's the uh-huh, or sure, or of course, or okay, all those kind of short statements are our way of affirming their perception. It doesn't necessarily mean we are agreeing with their perception, because it may be completely different, but remember, it's irrelevant about as far as what we personally believe. But we can encourage and affirm what the client is sharing, because that is the reality of what we are dealing with in that circumstance with the client. So careful with I understand. I know the textbook says to use it. I personally think that you can get yourself in deep water quickly when you use it on certain clients. The reason being is that some clients, when you say, I understand this is really hard for you, they might look at you and say, do you really? Do you really understand? Have you ever had a mother who is addicted to crack and a father who pimps out young ladies on the street? Is that really something you can understand? We find ourselves in trouble when we try to say I understand, because the reality is while I may try to understand and I can just imagine the situation, I may not fully understand because I will never go exactly through the situation in the exact same way as my client. So I like to steer away from I understand, and instead with my clients I use things like I can only imagine how difficult this must be for you, or based on what I've heard, I can just sense that you are committed to making this improve in some way, shape, or form. Or you can use the tag-in statement of, I can see this is really weighing on you. And this is all observational, or it's me imagining, but I'm not going to presume that I understand exactly what that person's going through, because the reality is I probably don't. And I probably may not ever be able to fully understand, but I'm sure going to try. And so make sure that you're careful with how you word that so your client feels validated and doesn't necessarily surprise you with the, really? Do you really understand? Natural empathy. This is a key ingredient. This is an important one in this course, and regardless of what you do, because empathy is that main foundation. If you are not naturally empathic, if you haven't learned how to show genuine empathy to your clients, they will sense that. And they will sense if you really care for their well-being or not. And if they sense that you don't, or you haven't learned how to show that you do, they will be less likely to return to you. Because if you're not empathic, then they're going to wonder, well, I'm not going to go back to him or her because they don't really care about me. So why should I waste my time? So empathy is different from sympathy. Sympathy is the poor you, or I feel so bad, or oh, I am experiencing these emotions just like you and I'm crying with you because this is awful that we're going through this. That's sympathy. Empathy is different because instead I'm imaginatively entering my client's world and of how they think, feel, and act, yet I do not get lost in their world. So I'm not sucked in where I'm lost in the emotions of it and I've completely lost sense of who I am and what my role is in the circumstance. And so that is the biggest difference of empathy, is that you're entering their client's world. You're literally walking in their shoes and imagining and thinking how it would be without losing sense of yourself. And that's a big difference from sympathy, which can suck us in where we're all of a sudden now entrenched with our clients. Big difference. Make sure that you're practicing natural empathy, not sympathy. Walk a mile in their shoes. And I forgot I had some emphasis here on these pieces, so there, they've all caught up. So how to express empathy. I've had so many students say, well, I feel for this client. I can't believe what they've been through, but how do I let them know that? Oftentimes in our own expression, whether it's a knowing nod of our head, whether it's an empathic glance or the look in our eye or a compassionate tone of voice, sometimes being respectful with our silence and being able to say, wow, this is tough. I'm just going to give us a moment. Sometimes using our paraphrases or summaries to convey the understanding of the significance of what the client is saying. So being able to paraphrase back and saying, I am just amazed and astounded at what you have survived and what you have managed to live through, and yet your ability to have a positive attitude in spite of it. I'm blown away, and I can see that you have really survived a lot. That's a way of being able to express empathy. So some examples at the bottom here is I can see that things with your career are not as you'd hope, and that's an empathic statement. You've been through quite an ordeal, or this has been a difficult situation for you. How have you managed? Those are all ways of being able to express empathy, and there are ways that you will learn along the way of how to verbally or non-verbally show your client empathy. Normalizing, this is a skill. We don't highlight it too extensively in this course, but I want you to be aware of it because it is a helpful skill. This is the opportunity where you have to wonder with your client about whether their situation and their reactions to their situations are normal. Are they basically within the normal range of others? Sometimes our clients will feel isolated, like they are the only one who has ever experienced their circumstance and they are alone. And for those clients, it can be helpful to explore that with them and help them maybe see that, you know what, you're not alone in this, because there are strength in numbers, and there are other people that these are normal reactions, and it validates that. Now notice it's very different than normalizing it for the sake of minimizing their struggle. When we say, oh, don't worry about it, this is normal, you're going to be fine, that completely minimizes their circumstance, and that's not what we want to do. What we do want to do is help to normalize it in a way that it depathologizes their difficulties, so it makes it less, I'm the only one in the world that's going through this, and instead it might allow them to feel like, wow, okay, then maybe it's okay that I do feel this way if other people feel this way in a similar circumstance. So some examples. Do you think these emotions are normal for someone who has had a loved one die suddenly as you have? That's one way of asking. Another way is being able to state it. You've just experienced a traumatic loss. A wide range of intense feelings can only be accepted considering the circumstance. These are ways to normalize and help that client feel like, you know what, maybe these feelings are okay. Maybe I need to allow myself to just go through this process. So some other skills as we wrap things up. Returning the focus to the client. You will have clients that will be very upset. They will have a lot of things to discuss, but it will be about everyone else, and it will not pertain to them. It will be how the husband needs to change, how the wife needs to change, how their children are a mess and they need to change, how their boss needs to change. Make sure that you start practicing respecting their perceptions. It's not your job to fix it. It's your job to respect, to understand, and to guide the process. But you want to ask questions to help return them back to the focus being themselves, which some questions could be, what's it going to take to improve this situation? Or what tells you that this situation can even get better? Those are some ways to return the focus to the client. Another skill is exploring their meanings associated, whether it's their success, possibilities, or interactional, in other words, relationships that they may have. Understanding what those things mean. Sometimes we may think we know what something means, but we might need to really ask, because remember, if we have set aside our own preconceptions, then we have a blank slate. So when a client says something, we may not really understand what that something means, and it's important to explore and ask the right questions so that you are understanding the proper meaning, not what you're maybe guessing that it means. And relationship questions, as I mentioned earlier, because you figured out who is important to the client, now when it comes to certain questions that the client may get stuck in or you just want a different angle in, you can use those relationship questions in that context. So, for example, asking things like, what do you think your children will notice is different about you? Or what would your professors notice that's different about you? Because you've highlighted already who's important, now you can ask these type of questions that connect them. And I love the little cartoon in the corner. I'm a freshwater fish in a saltwater world. And his fish therapist is listening. Amplifying solution talk. You want to make sure that you amplify what would be different when the solution is achieved. And so when you hear hints of possibility, when you see that the client is thinking about what could happen instead of the problem and what would be helpful, you want to ask those questions. What would be helpful? How would it be helpful? So you can amplify the ability to find those solutions that maybe might naturally be emerging as a client is sharing. Last part of this chapter dealt with leading from one step behind. So if you're coming from the posture of not knowing, now you're coming from the stance of also leading from one step behind. Since you're not the expert, you're not towing the line and having your client follow behind you and you lead the way, but instead you're letting them lead the way and you're using your skills as you lead from behind, remaining active in the collaborative process. As you can see, all the skills we've covered are extensive and they take a skill level to be able to effectively use them. And so when you're using those skills that you've developed, then you can lead the client from behind in an active manner, trying to explore and move the client from problem talk to solution talk. And there's 3 things you can do: making sure that you're listening and you're scanning those utterances for solution-focused possibilities. You're picking out possibilities by selecting out which ones you think are most useful to respond to at which point in the interview, and then you're building. Maybe you're saying something or asking a question or doing both to invite the client to build on a solution-focused direction. So listening, selecting what matters most, and then building on that for solutions for your client. So these are some ways that you can lead from one step. And to wrap things up, God gave us each 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. I believe we need to listen more. So often we are so quick to talk, and that is the skill that we have perfected, is talking. But this course is to help you learn how to listen in a way that will make your client feel heard so that you can both work together to find those solutions. And in James 1:19 it says, "Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." And so may we become quick to listen to our clients the way they need to be heard, and slow to speak so that way we can make sure the words that we use are calculated and measured and help establish the solution building process. That's all for this lecture. Thanks for staying by, and I'll see you next time.